Live. How are you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Looking forward.
Yeah, really excited to talk to you. Been reading your stuff on Substack for a while. Um, really big. You've got this background in academic, really high level academic philosophy, and then I think a real talent for writing these accessible, meaningful pieces. We're going to talk about your Substack writing and your philosophy today. But to kick things off, I was interested in how well, your background in academic philosophy and then how you got into writing more popular philosophy or accessible philosophy.
Yeah. Background in philosophy. I majored in philosophy in college. I actually started out college intending to major in economics. And that comes across in the Substack. I've maintained an interest in the field, but I ended up just really falling in love with my philosophy classes and kind of haven't looked back. Um, but yeah, then how I got into doing like Substack popular philosophy, it's really my co-author on the blog, Matt Wansley, was like, "Hey, we should start a blog." And he was kind of nagging me about starting for a while, and eventually I said, like, okay, fine, I'll do it. And now I post way more than him, like, and now I'm the one nagging him to eventually post. um but part of the reason I think, especially now with another baby, another new child, it's harder to get like really long blocks of time for writing academic papers. And so I was part of the appeal for me is like a totally selfish one, that writing in smaller chunks, where I don't worry about like being as exhaustive and citing the literature, but just like try and get my work out there. Like, it kind of lowers the bar to getting a thought out that maybe I'll then follow up with a more serious paper later on. Like, I still have intentions in that direction for some of my Substack posts. The one on fiction and empathy in particular, given that as a more academic version of that. Um, so yeah, part of it was that with less time, it seemed appealing to have a venue for writing where it wouldn't take as long to get something out as it does with an academic article, which is a lot more.
Yeah, so like it's a creative, almost like a creative output. It's a bit easier to just to write. There is that sort of that restrictive aspect of academic philosophy, which you're talking about being exhaustive and having all the footnotes in the right place and kind of reading the literature exhaustively, as you said.
I mean, it's also just more, there's more instant gratification to post it on Substack because you can immediately talk to people about it.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of probably my favorite part of philosophy is talking to people about it. Like, I love, conferences and workshops. And so with my own writing, it's like the part that I like best is, presenting it and getting, talking to people back and forth. And when it comes to journals, that's just a really slow process. Like, you write something, you send it off. Maybe it's accepted a year after you sent it off, between like getting rejected once or twice, or editors taking a long time, or referees taking a long time with it. And then once it's out, like if somebody's going to reply to it, that's another several years because they've got to decide to read it. Whereas, in Substack, you post something and people are commenting the next day.
Yeah, I remember I was talking to somebody and they were like, "Why are you doing philosophy?" It was actually one of my jiu-jitsu coaches, and they were saying, "Why are you interested in philosophy?" And it's like, "Well, I love sharing these ideas. I love talking about these ideas. I want to expose, ancient philosophy or stoicism to more people." And they're like, "Well, and how does academia?" Like academia is one route to do that, but it's not the only route to do that, right? And if your goal is to have as many conversations as possible, you'd probably have more conversations or share with more people if you post in these more public areas. And that was a bit of an epiphany for me, where I was like, was thinking, well, philosophy only happens in the academy. That's the only spot for it. And I've been really impressed in Substack and Facebook and Discord. Those conversations you said, but also just the quality of the conversations and the amount of interest that people have. I don't wanna say they're doing it recreationally, but it's like they're not professional. They're not philosophers in an academic context, but they're still incredibly well read and insightful, and you have these interesting conversations. Has it been similar for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think philosophy especially should, like, for philosophers especially, should feel some obligation, at least collective obligation in this direction. So I'm not saying everybody has to do it, but why do I say that? Well, like if you're, a biochemist, you could say, I don't care about making my papers accessible. I care about making drugs accessible. So, like, what are what's the rest of society getting from my biochemistry? They're getting my drugs, or you know, other biochemical products that that I've created. But with philosophy, like if it's going to benefit anybody, like you have some idea if it's going to benefit anybody other than you. I don't mean to say that just like the pleasure of understanding something on your own is worthless. I don't think it's worthless, but still, like if it's going to have some broader significance, it's going to be because you um, made it intelligible to somebody else, right? It's not that you translated it into some product that can be enjoyed, even if you don't understand the thinking that went into it, the way that, say, drugs or iPhones are.
Yeah, well, and that's what I like about your Substack pieces. I find there's something actionable. Like um, one of our co-host Caleb, he had this general heuristic of like if you debate something for a long time and it doesn't make you do anything differently or doesn't make you act differently, like what was really the point in doing it? And I find, or talking about it or understanding it, and I find, I mean, I get those from your pieces, and I want to kind of dig into some of those. Um, so on that line of conversation, so your piece, rationality, self trust, and asset prices. I really enjoyed that one. I want to start there. Um, what does index investing have to teach us about practical epistemology and trusting our own judgments?
Yeah. So I'll say the class that got me interested in epistemology, or at least that made me think, oh, like that's the area of philosophy that I really want to focus on. It was an undergraduate philosophy of religion class, actually, which was really unusually organized, right? It was not a survey, it was just like three topics. And one of the topics was disagreement. And so you, you think about this in the context of religion, where I think, why or how, if at all, could it be rational to believe in one particular religion when you know that there are people who are just as smart as you out there who believe other ones? But then, like a common move that gets made is noticing this isn't really specific to religion. So, like, yeah, maybe there's a challenge here to believing in any particular religion, but you're also going to have a challenge to believing in, uh, you know, distinctive or controversial views that aren't widely shared about just about any topic. Um, and some people, like somebody we read, Peter Van Emwagen, thinks, okay, great, that just shows that there isn't a real threat to religion here because nobody's going to be broadly skeptical about controversial questions. So, uh, in his case, he basically wanted to deflect the skeptical challenge to religious belief. My reaction to reading to that is, yeah, there is a really general skeptical challenge here. I find myself with all sorts of beliefs that I know aren't widely shared, uh, but reflected on the fact that both people disagree, or that I might not have had the beliefs, that I've been raised in a slightly different environment, but it's not clear that I thereby have been any worse placed to figure out the truth. Like that can induce a lot of uncertainty. Um, Okay, so I haven't said anything about asset prices, but I think like a special case of this, where this is absolutely right, is beliefs about things that are relevant to asset prices. So, like, lots of people have beliefs about artificial intelligence. Like, is it going to kill us all? Is it going to totally upend the labor market? And I feel like most people, you talk to, at least if they're like the kind of people that go on Substack or that post on Substack, they're going to have their own takes. Um, but questions about the effects of artificial intelligence, like those are questions that people who've thought a lot harder about than I have, or than most people have, um, and not just thought a lot harder, but they spent a lot more time on it because they have a lot of money riding on it. Basically, those are questions in which a lot of time and effort has already been invested by people who have a lot of skin in the game, a lot of interest in getting answers right. And those views are reflected in things like the current value of NVIDIA, and other, say, assets that are kind of tied to the performance of artificial intelligence. So, like, if I personally was inclined to think this is just a fad, it's just hype, it's not really going to go anywhere, I would thereby implicitly be thinking all these people who've spent lots and lots of time and money you know, uh, trying to figure out where to invest their resources, a lot more than I have thinking about artificial intelligence. Lots of them have decided that Nvidia is worth investing a lot of money in. Right, that's why its value has grown so much over the last 10 years. So even if my like intuitive take was to think this is all hype. Um, I think there'd be a powerful reason to question that by seeing just how many people who invested how much a lot more time and money than I have, and who I should think are no worse placed, probably better placed than I am to figure out the truth. Think that Nvidia is a good investment. And I'm just using Nvidia as a special case, but like once you take seriously the fact that other people who are just as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than you are have thought really hard about a question and have made consequential decisions that embody answers to the question that then show up in asset prices. And I'm just picking AI and NVIDIA because that's like a really easy example, but there are lots of other examples. Like maybe you think Trump is going to cause inflation to go through the roof. Well, lots of people are trying to figure out exactly how much inflation there's going to be, and their judgments are reflected in the difference between inflation protected treasury bonds and not inflation protected treasury bonds. And so if you're sticking with your own take rather than the take that's implicitly there in asset prices, that to me strikes me as like epistemically hubristic.
Mhm. Yeah, that was the position that I took. Was we generally think that that is a bad idea, or if you're bought into this idea of index investing, if you're bought into this idea of just buying the market, it's from you said it's like I'm not going to have some sort of edge over these experts who have skin in the game, who spent their lifetime calculating this. So I'm just going to kind of bet on maybe the average, or trust that these assumptions have been priced in. And so what I was taking from the piece was, um, it's hubristic. It's hubristic to then, try to pick stocks, but we do this all the time in other domains of our life as well. We have that same kind of hubris. It's an easy example of the stock market, but we're like that elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, so the stock market is the easiest case because you're kind of all betting on the same question, and you know that there are people who have spent more time and money than you, who like have uh, uh, you know skin in the game with respect to that question. So like I think it's easiest to make the case that if you think that inflation is going to be a lot higher than the market says, like where do you get off? Um, when it comes to other case like other cases, right, I think it's I don't think the reasoning totally breaks down. I think it's just harder to make the really pointed case that, in part, because it's often harder to find the skin in the game, right? Like, so I stuck with uh, religious belief, but that's a case where it's not like there are people making lots of a long string of practical decisions that turn on which religion is right or wrong, and getting winning or losing money, like making profits based on having been reliable enough about that, the way that say people have been in asset markets for a long time, have kind of earned up some credibility. So if you're going to think that your or religious or moral or political beliefs are right. Um, Even though I still think this kind of skeptical reasoning should like make you less confident, I think it doesn't get as much of a bite because there's less pressure to think that people who disagree with you um, are likely similarly reliable, because if they're still kind of in the game, they can't have been going radically wrong. The way that I would say, if uh, you know, people trading Nvidia are still out there, have plenty of money to trade, they're probably not doing terribly at making decisions about asset prices.
Yeah, it almost seems to me like there's two kinds of pursuits. There's ones that are like quantifiable or provide immediate, discrete feedback, and then there's ones that are like more amorphous. Like so, religion is this example where you could bet wrong, and presumably you're only receiving feedback once when you die or something like this.
Right?
Yeah, and it's not communicable. But like other domains, I mean, I just generally think it's good advice. I'm just like persuaded by the skeptical argument. If you think about like diet and exercise or health more generally, if you think about, you do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, that's something we talked about before we went live. Like that's a great example of let's not reinvent the wheel. Like what are the world champions doing? what are the professional coaches advocating for? They've got skin in the game because if they make bad athletes, they lose their job, or if an athlete performs poorly. And so I should defer to that person until I at least have a kind of extreme expertise that allows me to then, think I've gained some sort of knowledge. I generally like that call for humility. Is that tracking for you?
Yeah, totally. I actually, I I was also about to bring up jujitsu and this connection. So I think part of what makes a lot of people who like jujitsu like it is uh, this kind of account we have of the history or the lore of the sport, where in the battle days, like in the 80s and 90s, and before then, people would have these arguments about like which, what would win in a fight? Like, would Bruce Lee beat up Mike Tyson or what? And we have the stereotype of practitioners of traditional martial arts that don't really have a sportive component, still being caught up in those arguments. Whereas we realize, no, like the only way to settle those questions is to set up the kinds of institutions that allow for that kind of testing and feedback and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work. Mixed martial arts, and it didn't. And that's not even totally self-serving. Like maybe at the beginning, it seemed like, oh, and it vindicated us. Jiu-jitsu is the best. I mean, really, it's not like people already did jiu-jitsu. Rather, people saw it work so well in, UFC and Pride. And I think that was a big part of what drove its popularity. But even now, I think most of us jiu-jitsu practitioners would probably honestly admit that, pure jiu-jitsu is not the best thing to do for the success of mixed martial arts. Like nobody mixed martial arts does pure jiu-jitsu without wrestling and striking.
Uh-huh. Except for maybe like a Crone Gracie or something, and like that does it's not. I mean, even he's doing striking, but it's not viable now. So there's that idea of what jujitsu brought was like a way of getting concrete feedback. Um, it was like, and that's that difference between traditional martial arts. I mean, we can go down this martial arts rabbit hole. I mean, like, I love talking about this stuff, but like, I always see that issue with traditional martial arts is that you're not getting the feedback. You're like, well, don't actually try to do the technique to me because it's too dangerous. Don't actually hit me full out. And then it's like, even if the technique is hypothetically better or more efficient, it becomes practically worse because you're not getting immediate actionable feedback about your defense and so
100%, yeah.
yeah.
And it was not just traditional like martial arts that are billed as being more like realistic and street ready, like Krav Maga, right? We do ball twisting and eye gouging. And I said, well, have you ever really tried to gouge out somebody's eyes when they're really trying not to let you? Like, I don't know what the obstacles to that. I haven't tried to do that. I haven't tried to twist somebody's balls. How easy it is to grab balls through jeans. I don't know. And you're never going to find out either because you're not really going to have somebody full 100% trying to twist balls because you just wouldn't get any training partners that way. For
Yeah.
good.
My my coach has this joke where you can only practice eye gouging twice, and then it's like, so you can't do it many times. Yeah.
So I mean, this is kind of gruesome, but what was that? The tournament that Choke was about, right? Hicks.
Mm,
I want to say it was one of the there's one of these early '90s tournaments, which really was no holds barred, and somebody did lose sight in one eye. I'm not going to remember his name. He's I think a Japanese fighter who was
yeah.
against a much bigger, taller French kickboxer. I want to say Gerard Gordeau.
It
Um,
was, yeah. Is the guy who came
yeah,
second in the first UFC. Yeah,
yeah.
Gerard.
Um, and the guy who got his eye gouged out still did beat that other guy using submission grappling techniques. I think it was some kind of leg lock. But yeah, now we don't let people do that because what insane people are going to want to go in for a sport where they're likely to be blinded.
So what this is making me think of, what is your approach? So then we talked about these two tracks, and there's these domains that you have kind of concrete, discrete, measurable feedback. And I don't think there's really any excuse for being hubristic in those domains. At least that's my opinion. Um, but what do you do, religion, I think in ethics in the same way, when it seems to be more based on intuition, or we don't have this concrete kind of victory condition. I made more money than you. I ran faster than you. What is the approach to epistemic humility or disagreement in those kinds of domains?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just harder to justify extremes of confidence in domains where you get less feedback, right? So I think it is reasonable for me to be extremely confident that if you take somebody
Mhm.
that's trained a lot of wrestling and you take somebody that's trained a lot of taekwondo, neither is trained either, anything else, and you put them in a ring, I'm very confident about who will win because we've had lots of experience. But you uh, we've the domains you just mentioned. I think in the face of disagreement, we just don't get the kind of signals we'd like for resolving who's more reliable, who's more trustworthy about those domains. I don't want to go all the way to saying, okay, so you've got to treat everybody as equally reliable, and you can't have any opinions about that kind of stuff. But I also don't have a satisfying explanation for kind of uh, what grounds any entitlement you have distinctive opinions of your own that differ from kind of the average of kind of informed world opinion, or even how you decide who counts as informed opinion. I mean, in part, I think the reason that we don't get a skeptical argument going really quickly is if we could say, well, here are all these people that are equally reliable, and they all disagree. So your opinion should be kind of some average of what all these equally reliable people think. We can't even get that far because we can't say who are all the equally reliable people. So if anything, we say, well, look, maybe I think these people are reliable. They strike me as pretty reasonable. Granted, I don't have some non-question begging argument for that, and so I'm going
Mhm.
to hold that view about who's trustworthy with some level of humility. The way that I think I do have non-question begging arguments that wrestlers will be taekwondo fighters. Uh, so yeah, basically what I'm saying is I think you don't end up having to be an across the board skeptic because we can't argue that all these equally reliable people disagree, and so you have to have some opinion that's the average of all their views. Um, I think that there's nothing obviously wrong with having some distinctive views about who's more and less trustworthy about these squishier domains. Um, but those distinctive views aren't going to be defensible by solid non-question begging arguments.
Mhm. I mean, that makes sense to me. So I understand, right? It's like we have, we shouldn't be hubristic in the areas where there's experts. We should be humble to the experts, and then we shouldn't be hubristic in the areas where there's not experts. And even more reason to be kind of cautious in those areas. That's what I was taking your position to be. So we can have some sort of confidence in, I don't know, the high confidence domains, but if you're not an expert, it probably just means relying on somebody else. And then the other ones, it's almost like again, religion, ethics, it's almost free form. I wonder, I do think about like, I'm always thinking kind of like a stoic perspective on this. I wonder if the stoic argument is going to be something about how, at least if we look at ethics, religion is a bit messier, but if we look at ethics, we can say, is there some sort of unanimous agreement about what bad is or what wrong is? And we can almost form some sort of negative picture or what kind of bad lives are. Maybe that's still a bit amorphous, but maybe we get some sort of agreement. Um, Even if it's a vague position about, some types of lives are unambiguously bad, maybe we can't decide what the good one is. I don't That doesn't get us that far, but it gets us something maybe.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might not solve it today. And so anything else on this one? I thought that was a really interesting point. I might actually jump to another piece, how to cheat the thief of joy.
Yeah, sure.
Um, and so what in there you outline, you know, there's this dilemma or problem we have around comparison and how this hampers our capacity to be happy. And then you outlined, I thought it was really compelling, three strategies against that. Well, what are those strategies, and can you speak to them each a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so first, like a slight connection between what we were just talking about and this. I feel like the the way in which comparison can be the thief of joy, like is especially salient for those of us who are like disposed towards being excessively competitive. And so, like, maybe if you're doing jujitsu, that's you. I feel like that's probably me. Um, okay, so one, I think part of the reason that our tendency to judge how well we're doing by comparing ourselves to other people is so poisonous is that we tend to compare ourselves to our our friends, our social circle, like people that are around us, that we encounter, every day. Um, and in an important way, that's like a super skewed sample because I think pretty much anybody watching on Substack right now should think of themselves as radically fortunate, like part of a really select, unusual group of people that are alive at the most prosperous time in history. Um, so so yeah, basically, this first strategy is just trying to keep a sense of perspective of just um, how good almost everybody, not everybody in the world, but almost everybody in the world has it now compared to 200, 300, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, no matter where you look. So like even comparing yourself um, to kings, 500 years ago, like if a king, or like feudal lord 500 years ago, if he woke up and said to some servant of his, I would really like some beans from halfway around the world that can't be grown within 1,000 miles of here. I'd like those beans dried and crushed up and steeped in hot water. Um, I think that would get me going. And his vassal would say, like, I'm sorry, Lord, there's just nothing we can do. Those aren't grown for 1,000 miles from here. Whereas, I can do that on a whim, 3 times a day if I want. I did today. Or if that same Lord wants, strawberries in winter, sorry, he's screwed. But I can have strawberries in winter, just on a whim. Or music, right? Like it was a huge thing to have like live performers, right? Now I can listen to the greatest music ever written at the push of a button. And it's hard to, I think, maintain a constant sense of amazement at just how like near omnipotent we are compared to people in the past. But I still think it's worth trying because the more you can,
Yeah.
the more anything that's like not going well in your life, or where some in philosophy, somebody got a an article accepted in a journal where you just got an article rejected. Like it, it can seem really trivial when you think about how lucky you are compared to
Yeah.
almost everybody in this.
I really like that argument for two reasons. I mean, one, the Stoics make all the time these arguments about how a lot of our unhappiness comes from just our perspective. And so there's a lot of work in perspectival shifts. And Marcus Aurelius talks about this exercise of the view from above and just kind of shifting your perspective, not being so self obsessed or changing like the context you're thinking about. But I also like it because it's almost like self defeating. It's almost like, well, if you're going to compare properly. If you're going to compare yourself to other people, really compare yourself to other people and by like all people. And by that criteria, you're actually doing pretty amazing over the course of history. It's like, yeah, if it's just you and the other person who got their journal article accepted, yeah, but that's not really a fair comparison. It's like compare properly, which I like.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that was the first strategy. Right. The second strategy was look, if you can't help but compare yourself to these other extremely fortunate people in your social circle, because I admit that is like the natural thing to do. It helps to have idiosyncratic dimensions of comparison. So this is really an idea I get from Nozick. There's it's somewhere in Anarchy State and Utopia. There are like lots of interesting ideas just all over the place in that book. Um, but the idea is if you think of like status competition as unidimensional, right? There's just one dimension of status, and if I go up on it, then any gains that I've had are exactly counteracted by losses of the people that I've passed. That's the kind of really bleak picture. But it doesn't have to be that. Like, and maybe if you thought that status was just about, wealth or something, then yeah, like if I get, and all that matters is how much wealth I have compared to other people. Then we get that kind of bleak picture. Um, but there are lots of dimensions. Ooh, what, are you gone?
I'm
I
still
don't
here.
see.
Sorry.
Okay, good.
Let me fix
Uh,
my camera.
uh, okay, yeah, but it doesn't. So the Nozick thought was we can have lots of different dimensions of status, and where different people place different weight on dimensions of status. So the way that I'd put it in the post, you can imagine the Philistines that just care about wealth, and the Bohemians who just care about art, and maybe the Philistines are they feel good about themselves for being wealthier than the Bohemians, and the Bohemians can feel good about themselves for being more creative and original than the Philistines. And now, status competition doesn't have to seem as zero sum and as tragic. Um, so, okay, what does that mean? And then just an aside that I have is like the internet is great for this because now we can have all sorts of idiosyncratic communities that value different sorts of things where almost anybody can feel like special and distinctive and doing well along some idiosyncratic dimension of comparison that most people um, just don't think about. um, and so the kind of tongue-in-cheek way that I put this in the post, again tie back to jujitsu that we've been talking about, um, is those people that have more citations than me and just got a papers into journals that rejected my journal or rejected my paper. Still, in most cases, I could beat them up because I do jujitsu and they don't do jujitsu. Now that doesn't bother them because they don't care as much about jujitsu. Maybe they care about other stuff. But the point is, if each of us has, it doesn't just invest all of our ego and self worth and concerns about comparison and status in one dimension of that, but has a bunch of different ones, then there never has to be somebody else who we think is just strictly speaking doing better than us. We can always find something we really care about where things are going better for us than for them. And this is meant to be very much a kind of second best approach. Like if you can just not be so focused on comparing yourself to other people, great, do that. But realistically, many of us don't. And so being able to reassure ourselves that even somebody else who's doing great along these various dimensions, they're not beating me along this other dimension, and I really care about that one too. That's the second strategy that I discussed in the post.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm not sure how much people care or you care about seeing me. I tried to read the comments and accidentally pressed a button, and then I think cannot figure out how to reactivate my camera, which is part of doing it live. Um, we'll keep going. I might try a little bit, but at the risk of closing the whole thing, I might be cautious. Audio only for me. Um, yeah, no. So I mean, 2 points there. I think it's a really good strategy. It's one I've used myself. I think it was a kind of irony when I read your post and you'd be like, I would be world champion at jujitsu and philosophy. And then I'm like, that's my idiosyncratic. So for those, I was like, for those that don't know, I have a PhD in philosophy and then I'm a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. So you put that and I was like, oh no, we've now created our own little side competition.
Yeah. So,
Um,
so what I've managed to infer, you'd definitely be beating me at jujitsu.
yeah, but I think you have much better philosophy. So, um, but that was just a little joke where it's like you try to run away into your idiosyncratic mix, and then you find the other person who's really good at your two things, and you're like, this can't be. Um, the logical extreme of that. So like, I just think it's good advice, and it's been like practically effective in my life, and I found a lot of meaning and joy in being like, I'm the best at I don't know if best is again, there's some unhealthiness to trying to be the best as you've raised, but I'm particularly good at this unique mix of things that are interesting and eclectic and unique to me. Which I think is it's a better life strategy if you're trying to maximize happiness than trying to be, I'm going to just be the best basketball player and I'm going to be only do basketball. And then when I end up just, not becoming LeBron James because that's so incredibly impossible and hard to do, I'll feel like a failure. But I really like it as a strategy, but I kind of feel like the logical extreme of that, taking it to its logical conclusion, is just being happy with being yourself. Like the ultimate idiosyncratic mix of characteristics are just all the things you happen to like in all the ways that are unique to you. And so it almost kind of wraps full circle and you kind of leave the status or comparison game if you keep going with it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like the point. I mean, and maybe if you can do that, great. Um, I think there are probably limits to what what we can get ourselves to care about, right? So, um, if I'm thinking of like a really uh, if yourself is just things are going terribly for you along all sorts of dimensions, then even though you can identify something really just like some distinctive thing that you've got that nobody else has, but it's not something that like seems good at all then. But like I'm the only person whose third and fourth fingers on their hand are exactly like the ratio between them that my third and fourth fingers on my hand are. Like I'm maybe the best at having that ratio, but I'm just who could get themselves to care about that.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think there are probably psychological limits to how far you can push this strategy.
Yeah, your point is it's got to be a mix of things that are meaningful both to yourself and probably to society in some capacity. And if you're just
Yeah,
like,
yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Basically, I think there are probably psychological constraints on what I can get myself to find meaningful, and that can still leave a lot open, right? There can be things that I don't care about right now that if I kind of invested effort in, I could get myself to appreciate and then and then care about, but not just anything.
yeah. And then so what was the third one?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an extent, maybe not that different from where we just were. But the thought was some uh sorry, I'm just hanging up. I'm getting a call and um so some things that we care about lend themselves more to comparison than others. Um so maybe the more sort of quantifiable something is, the more we can then compare our quantity with respect to that to somebody else's. Um, but then some things, some experiences or activities or mentions of value, they just don't lend themselves to comparison at all, and so we're just less. To the extent you care about that, the question of how you're doing, compared to somebody else, is just much less likely to strike you as salient. And so the example I gave was parenting, where there are all sorts of
Mm.
wonderful aspects of parenting. Like I love reading to my kids at night. You know, sharing enjoyment of stories that I read when I was a kid, or maybe reading stories that I didn't read when I was a kid, and sharing enjoyment of those. And it just doesn't like if somebody else is reading those same stories and his kids are also liking those stories with him, that doesn't feel like it takes away at all from my enjoyment of my stories with my kids. In the way that maybe being beaten at jujitsu does feel like it takes away from the pride that I take in jujitsu. Um, and I think there are probably a lot of things like that. So I drew this connection to this distinction that Kieran, I never know how to say his name, Setia or Satya. I'm going to say Setia. Um, Kieran Setia draws between what he calls telic and atelic projects. And roughly, like telic projects are like things that you can complete, like you know, climbing Mount Everest. Like, okay, I've done that. And with telic projects, they just lend themselves more to kind of counting and comparing. So once you've climbed Mount Everest, you can say, well, who else has climbed Everest? Have they also climbed K2? Like, how many mountains can I climb? Whereas atelic projects, or atelic ends or pursuits. I think projects are more the telic things. It's more like uh, walking or listening to music or reading, where you're less likely to chunk it up into units and then think, okay, I'm done with this. Uh, and so I think of like parenting as one of these
Mhm.
kind of atelic projects where it's just much less natural to think of it in terms of milestones that you've reached in your parenting, or like you're not comparing how many kids you have. Oh no, I've got this many kids, but somebody else has more, gotta catch up. I feel like those questions just don't feel nearly as pressing uh, as questions of comparison do when we're thinking about things more like that are more easily quantifiable, or that more lend themselves to quantification and comparison, like these like explicitly competitive pursuits, like jujitsu.
Yeah, well, so two thoughts on this. One is it seems to me like you can approach the same craft telically or atelically. And the jujitsu, it's like I want to get a black belt or I even want to get a blue belt. And you see the kind of frustration that comes on grading day when the person doesn't get a stripe or they don't get a blue belt. And I think about this about, I've been a black belt for 9 years now. I'm still training consistently. It's just like it's not about it's not about belting. There's no more belts. I'm just doing it as because I enjoy the kind of the art of it, instead of the goal. And I was thinking that as well, by your parenting example. Like you say that parenting is atelic, but we're expecting our first child, and
Oh,
um,
congratulations!
yeah, thank you. But like baby Instagram makes it seem very comparison. There's this real temptation when you get on parenting social media to be, oh, you need to be a good parent, you need to do things like this. And so it almost feels like I get your point that it's probably when it's quantifiable, it probably lends itself to being completionist in that way. Probably lends itself more easily to that. But I think you could probably frame or approach things either the healthy way or the unhealthy way, the telic way or the atelic way, is one thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? So yeah, we probably shouldn't talk about telic activities or pursuits. I think you're right to say it's more like a mindset.
Mhm.
And so, I think jujitsu can be done in this telic way where you care about getting the belt or winning the competition, and and I think yeah, like you say, that does often lead to I mean, there's a stereotype in jujitsu: people get the blue belt and then they're done.
Mhm.
Um,
They
and I
climbed
feel
the
like
mountain.
my kids are. I will sometimes have this exchange with them where they'll be like, "Oh, do you think we're going to get another belt at some point?" I'm kind of inclined to say like, "Who cares about the belts? It's just a piece of cloth. Just enjoy doing jujitsu." Um, uh, and yeah, then even with things that like say parenting that strike me as atelic, where it seems less natural to go in for the comparison, you're totally right that you can find plenty of people on social media, bragging about how early their kids walked or read, or oh, my infant was potty trained before they were 4 months old. But you do hear these. I don't know if it's all competition, but hear stories about people like holding infants over the toilet. None of my kids have been potty trained like before they're 3 years old. Uh, I guess for me, I find it easier to ignore that. It may help that we homeschool, so we're like uh, we don't have kids in the same class as other kids where we're going to talk to other parents of kids in the same class in ways that might make comparisons really salient. But yeah, I totally take the point that that's um, another trap that I imagine you can get drawn into.
Yeah, I guess it's just be careful about anything, anything approaching it this way, unless that's intentional and there's a purpose for doing that, because it's probably less satisfying, to be incredibly goal oriented, less so as craft oriented. The other thing this made me think of, so obviously practice stoicism and very deep in that community for quite a long time. And one thing that I think about stoicism is that I wonder this distinction kind of made me realize something. I wonder if a risk in stoicism or philosophy as a way of life more generally is it makes life a kind of a telic project. Like stoicism has this idea of the sage or this perfect person, and everybody's striving to be this perfect. Like that is your target, that is your goal, that is your aim, and it almost makes they use a craft analogy all the time, the same way a lot of ancient philosophers did about living well as this craft. But there's this almost this mountain to climb, this like perfection to reach, and I wonder if that's counterintuitive and is kind of tripping off this comparison or unhappiness mechanism in people. It's a trap I find myself falling into. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Maybe I'm just going to ask you more about your take on stoicism. So uh, I was recently reading, and I think you mentioned this in um, uh, an email you sent before this. So, well, I'm teaching this great books class, and one of the things we read is Seneca on anger, um, and I mean, he basically thinks you should never get angry, and it's within your power to never get angry. Um, and it's not just anger, but this is just an example. Like, you think somebody killed your parents. This is an example he gives. Well, you should try to avenge them, but there's no need for anger. That's not going to. It's I have a much easier time reading that text as describing a kind of psychologically unattainable ideal, in a way that then I'm less likely to beat myself up for not reaching it than what I think he intends, which is no, he really does think it's in our power to never get angry because he thinks getting angry is always a voluntary decision. And you like, there's the kind of initial impulse towards anger, but you have to agree to it to kind of let it take over you to actually get angry. And you can just never do that. And yeah, I kind of want to go halfway in thinking a lot of the things that he says about like the ideal of the kind of um, the person who doesn't get angry are attractive, and it's not. Um, but I also don't really think it's realistically in my power to do that, and it's also maybe luckily like not that you know quantifiable how close or far I am to achieving it. So um, maybe this is just me not like being part of the stoicism community, but it's a bit hard for me to imagine like getting competitive with other people over how um uh you know how in control of our emotions we are. So like you see that guy, like he got angry last week. I haven't been angry in 5 months. I don't know. Is it like that? It's hard for me to imagine.
I don't think it's competitive like inter people. I mean, there might be, it might be, I mean, I don't want to speak for the whole community. I don't feel competitive with other Stoics, but you feel competitive with
But
yourself.
I'm even less competitive.
What's that?
No, sorry, it was a bad joke. I said I bet I'm even less competitive.
Yeah, yeah. You're even better at it. Yeah, I was status signaling there. The but I think you get competitive with yourself because there's this goal, and I mean the way I was interpreting your thing is, well, these problems kind of go away if you don't actually see it as a goal. You see it as maybe a model or an example or a thought experiment. But if you take it as that is actually a way that you should be, and you're failing if you're not the sage. Um, then so there's personal competitiveness or a personal sense of failure, right? Like if I'm trying to climb Everest, I don't think the unhappiness needs to come necessarily from that other person climbed Everest and I didn't. The unhappiness can be I didn't climb the mountain. I didn't achieve the objective goal, even though maybe that's not feasible for me because I'm older or I'm sickly in some capacity. And so instead of me just loving the craft, I have this kind of like objective standard I'm trying to reach, like making it to the NBA for the basketball example or something like this. And I do think that's the case, and that's the kind of competitiveness, at least I have with myself. And yeah, I mean, the point that I'm taking from what you were saying is one way to get around this is to just not try to be a sage, just try to be a better person, not try to be perfect, just try to be a better person. But I do think the Stoics are committed philosophically to the idea that that perfect person is possible. They
Yeah,
spend way too much time talking about what the person is like and what would happen if they got drunk, or what would it be happen if somebody tried to fool them, for them to not be committed to it.
yeah, no, I agree. That was certainly the more kind of modest view in the neighborhood of Seneca's that I was describing. I don't read that as his view. I think he
Yeah.
really thinks it is within all our powers to be sages.
Yeah, great. So maybe, I mean, maybe my takeaway from that there is just maybe I'll consider. I still don't know if I found a happy answer about, is there a benefit for it being a telic project? Is there a reason to hold on to that, or should I just treat it atelically, which would be, trying to pursue the craft of being a better person? I think there's still something for me to chew on there.
There is this analogy in epistemology where we like norms of rational belief, like consistency and coherence. Um, let's just stick with like consistency, right? Um, don't have any inconsistent beliefs, or sometimes people put this in probabilistic terms, like your opinions should be representable by levels of confidence that satisfy the probability axioms. And most people who like that as a kind of picture of the kind of normative ideal for belief also think it's not humanly attainable to fully
Hmm.
satisfy it. It's not realistic. But you can still think, like, look, whenever I notice I've got inconsistent beliefs, I'm going to think about how that might be resolved. Or whenever I notice, a probabilistic incoherence, like, hey, I thought this was more likely than that, and this was more likely than that, but this was more likely than that. That can't be. Again, think about how I might iron that out without thinking I'm ever going to get to the spot where there are, in principle, no tensions, no incoherencies, in my whole body of belief.
Yeah, how do I get better at mountain climbing without, judging my success or failure by climbing Everest? How do I get better at playing an instrument without I can still give myself feedback if I misplay a note. That doesn't mean the only way to be a good musician is to be perfect. Um, makes good sense to me. The last piece I wanted to get to was your piece, Great Books as Shelling Points. Am I saying that right, Shelling?
Yeah,
Yeah. So what are Shelling Points and how do they explain the power of great books?
yeah. So Schelling was this mid-century economist, um, and he had this idea. He didn't call them Schelling points, but uh, I can't remember what he called them, but they've come to be called Schelling points. And I think they're best illustrated with an example. I'll use the one that I used in that post, which is a slight modification of an example of his. So you imagine two people are traveling in Paris together. They're traveling companions, and they've gotten separated. And this is before the era of cell phones, so they can't easily contact each other. And you know, they've got to find each other. And maybe they've like all they know is they're both in Paris, right? They haven't gotten a hotel yet. There's like no kind of obvious place based on their shared plans for where they're going to meet. What do you think they're going to do? And Schelling's thought was they'll meet someplace like the Eiffel Tower, right? Because they'll think, what's just the most obvious, like salient point that I know the other person's going to be thinking about in Paris? It's the Eiffel Tower, so they'll both go to the Eiffel Tower and they'll meet. Maybe not a guarantee, but like they're going to do better than chance if they were just randomly picking places to go. And so, more generally, we can talk about Schelling points in a situation where we've got what economists will call a coordination game, where we care much more about coordinating our behavior than we do about exactly what we do. So another example would be like driving. Um,
Hmm.
in the US, we drive on the right, right? In the UK, they drive on the left. Doesn't really matter which one you do, though it does matter that everybody picks the same one. So in that sense, like everybody driving on the right, that's a Schelling point. Everybody driving on the left, that's a Schelling point. Um, some people driving in the, you know, people driving different places, like or some on the left, some on the right. That's not. Sorry, that maybe that's not actually a great example. I think the best way to think of it is when we have a coordination game, right? Uh, a solution to the game that suggests itself because you know that other people will be thinking in those terms. That's a Schelling point. So I shouldn't actually say that driving on the right or the left is because nothing really distinguishes the right versus the left. But it's more that when like there are a bunch of places you could go and all of them would be equally good to meet up at, but we pick this one because we know the other person will be thinking of it. That's what a Schelling point is. Okay, so what does that have to do with great books? Um, I think not all reading, but a lot of reading, especially reading about ideas, especially reading philosophy, has a coordination game aspect to it. Um, and that part of what we care about, not all of what we care about, but part of it is reading stuff that other people are reading. And that might sound like silly, like, oh, I just want to read stuff that's trendy or popular, but I don't think it has to be silly. I think it can be for very good reason. I think it can be because part of why we read things is to be able to have conversations with other people. It's like to share a kind of common intellectual language. And to the extent that that's part of why we read uh, works of philosophy, then it matters more that we coordinate, that we read the same things, than that we each try to read the best things. Because if we each try to read just what's best, then there's a good chance that we're going to disagree about what's best, and we'll read different things, and it'll be harder for us to communicate. So, say, example from the post. Uh, we want to read some. something that gets across the idea of utilitarianism, or stoicism, say. Um, uh, with utilitarianism, like Mill is a really good choice, not because Mill is the best expositor of the utilitarian picture. I don't think he is, but because if all I know is that we're all trying to read something utilitarian, well, Mill is the one that I know everybody else is going to be thinking of. And so if we've got to make this decision without being able to kind of all talk it out, then Mill is relevantly like the Eiffel Tower when it comes to utilitarianism. And that's why in our great books class, we have students read Mill rather than, trying to pick what we think the best kind of contemporary up to date version of utilitarianism is. And I might say something similar with Seneca, right? Um, uh, is that absolutely the best statement of the Stoic worldview? I don't know, probably not. Probably we could do better, but it helps to have these kind of touchstones so that we're at least all on the same page and discussing these ideas. Which is why I think it's nice to have these have a canon, and why I think we should be cautious or wary about trying to too quickly update or change the canon to replace works in it with better works. Because to the extent that we do that, the likely outcome is that people go in different directions. Everybody has different ideas about what the better replacements are, and we end up failing to coordinate. Relevantly, like the people who are trying to meet in Paris, but instead of just picking the place that the other person would be thinking of, the Eiffel Tower, they pick what they think is the best spot in Paris. And and since everybody's doing that, like they don't meet up.
Yeah, I thought it was a really compelling point, which is that I mean, as you said, the canon is about coordination, especially in something like philosophy. I mean, how many conversations do you have where even when you're trying to explain something new, it's like Kant, but or it's like it's like Plato, but this difference. And like so there's that huge coordination value of being able to situate what you're talking about in relation to something else somebody said. And that value, I think you said this in the piece, Eiffel Tower isn't the best building, it isn't the nicest building, but that's not what's being measured for when you're saying let's meet there. It's what is the most effective point of coordination. And so you can't replace things quickly. And there's not only can you not replace them quickly, there's a real danger to getting that wrong. I thought that was very it was very compelling. It seems to me like it has, I mean, some risks where you end up coordinating around the things that are. I guess my next question would be, what is the best way to then update the canon? Is there a way to do that effectively that isn't just the canon is not just self-reinforcing, which is this was the reference point, this was the coordination point. It's too dangerous to change it, especially because we're not talking about six friends meeting at a bar. We're talking about 70-year-old philosophers who went to school and 18-year-olds, since you're coordinating over such a long period of time. Is there sort of any way you talk about the new narratives and the history of philosophy in the piece? Is there a way to update the canon effectively? Um, yeah.
I tend to think like very slowly. Um,
Uh,
so So first, just to say, I think some Schelling points are really, really. I'm not saying the canon is like this, but I think some Schelling points are rightly really, really sticky. So an example that economists like is the QWERTY keyboard. That was not
uh-huh.
designed to be easy to type with. It was designed so that typewriters' keys wouldn't get stuck. And so if you were trying to design an optimal keyboard now for like ease of fast typing and ergonomic stuff, you would not design the QWERTY keyboard. Um, but I think we may be stuck with that for all time, or at least like for the foreseeable future, because I don't think there's any good way to like kind of gradually, gently move away from that in a way that's like worth the throwing off all these people who already know how to type. I don't think the canon is like that though, because when it comes to like, I mean, it's already kind of weird to be talking about this with great books courses because there just aren't as many of them as there used to be, and so we're already kind of moving away from them. But I still think it's worthwhile to try and do that relatively slowly, so we can get a chance to see whether we've managed to coordinate on something else, right? So if
Mm,
everybody agrees, look, we're basically going to keep a lot of the canonical books the same. Um, in philosophy classes, in history of philosophy classes, we're going to read Plato, we're going to read Aristotle, we're going to read Kant, we're going to read Hume. But then there's some like uh, you know changing around the edges. So maybe somebody reads Hegel, somebody else doesn't read Hegel. And somebody like there are various people that aren't canonical but might be put in with that class, and do that for a few decades and see if any of them kind of are significantly more popular than others in such a way that eventually we say, you know what, now we really think like this thing is part of the canon. And maybe similarly, you like experiment with dropping something that you think the weakest member of the canon. Like you can have, but maybe the analogy is, um, if you have like you can have point A connected to point Z, and there's not that much in common with them, so long as A overlaps a lot with B, and B overlaps a lot with C, and C overlaps a lot with D. Um, and so now you're thinking of these as points in time and like compositions of the canon. That was maybe eventually we can get from A to Z if Z is a better canon, but only by never having too much dissimilarity between what people at different times and different places are reading, because there's a lot of overlap between A and B and a lot of overlap between B and C and so on.
Yeah, that's compelling to me, and I also, I mean, I'm definitely on the team of great books. Like I definitely pro this. Um, it's also a way. People talk a lot about the jujitsu meta, and I apologies for people listening that don't train jujitsu, but we both do, so I'm going to keep going back to this. And it's when you take a martial art, jiu-jitsu is relatively new. It's like 60, 70 years, but there's some martial arts that have been around for thousands of years. Like wrestling back in ancient Greece. And if you think of philosophy as a tradition, I mean, at least in its modern form, since probably Oxford in the West, something like this. This is a really, really long time period. And so to expect a shift in 5, 10, 15, 20 years is such a small it's such a relatively small period of time, even though that might be a substantive period of an individual's professional life. And so maybe that puts into scale what moving slowly means when you're talking about a canon that's 1,000 years old, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I guess I also like, I'm not a historian of philosophy, so the stuff that I like write on and mostly talk to people at conferences is not this canonical stuff. And so I like both having your kind of canonical intro classes, the
Mhm.
composition of which I think should change pretty slowly, but also thinking that shouldn't be, the only stuff that people are thinking or talking about. I think you want some kind of churn and experimentation for new ideas, but it'll probably take a long time for any new ideas to be broadly accepted, and maybe eventually down the road make it into a canon.
Yeah. Great. Well, I mean, there's more I want to talk to you about on this, but maybe we'll have to do it another time. Dan, really appreciate it. That was a lot of fun. Just for those listening, any that happen to be coming from our audience, maybe what are you working on? If they want to hear more from you, where can they find your writing or your work? Just so, yeah, quick kind of spiel for the listeners about where they can find more about what you're doing and what
Yes,
you're up to.
I mean, I'm on Substack right here. I haven't been posting a ton this semester, but I'll be teaching less next semester, and so I imagine I'll get back to it more. And then I don't remember the name of my website, but if you just Google me, Dan Greco philosophy, you can find my academic work. Yeah, nothing really on Stoicism. Though I do have a recent book out that uh, is it? Well, if you have access to Oxford Scholarship online, you can read it online without actually getting the book. And if you're a student, through university, you probably do. So give that a look. I think especially like later on in the book, it gets kind of in the weeds, but I think the first two chapters are pretty broadly accessible.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much.